then, aren't we?
Sorry?
We're going to edit this better.
Of course, yeah. This is the muted video.
Let's do that.
You really like an answer, so.
Thank you. It's very nice of you, Mark. They can all hear that, by the way.
They could, yeah, it's all recorded.
Is that a bit clearer now? Great.
Okay, there we go. Right.
And then you start again, do I? Do I need to start at the beginning again, or can I just carry on?
Just
Fantastic.
let's go from where I am.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll talk to you about some of the work I've made. And again, like any questions you have, just ask away. So when I finished my degree and then finished my MA, I basically spent about 10 years kind of wasting my life. I was trying to be an artist, trying to make big, important projects, but I didn't really have any idea to make big, important projects about. So I spent most of them working in cafes, bars, restaurants, just to eat and live as you do, pretending to be something that really wasn't. And then I came across this idea, which was based on a project I'd made just after my MA, which included a couple of locations which were military defences on the coast of the UK, on the south coast of the UK. It's not a subject I had a specific interest in. I have no military background or historical background, but I found that over the years, and I was just talking to Mark about this, and even he remembers better than me, but in my MA, my work had these elements in it, not military elements, but it had history in it. And all my work over the last 20, 30 years has basically been about memory and history and landscape. It's generally been subjects that are in the distant past. So some subjects about the First World War, some subjects that happened during the Second World War, and more recently with my latest work, some subjects that are happening right now. And I never thought I'd been making work about the present for quite a few years, but it just happens that circumstances had led to that. But this work here, that you can see, this is an image here, is called The Last Stand. And this was a work I spent 4 years making. And obviously 4 years seems like a long time to make a piece of work. I spent 4 years making this project, then 6 years making the next one after that. So that's 10 years to make 2 pieces of work. I've then made 2 pieces of work in the last 2 years, which surprises me more than anybody else. It's just kind of happened that way. And I've never, and this is one of the joys in basically being my own boss in a way, being freelance and doing what I want to do, is I never have anyone telling me you have to have it finished by now. I don't have a lecturer behind me saying you have to have it finished in 4 weeks or 6 weeks. So in some ways it's really easy because I can take as long as I want, but I never take as long as I want. I take as long as I need to do that. And I hope you can get that difference there. Basically every decision I ever make about my work is based around the work itself. I don't limit myself by saying I've only got 6 weeks or 6 years in some cases, or a year to make a piece of work. It takes as long as it takes. And it's exactly the same with the books that I make as well. Because I self-publish my books now, it means that the book can be exactly the way the work demands. So the books that I now make are the page numbers they are because that's what the work needs. The book is the size it is because that's what the work wants. The paper is the paper it is because we've chosen that specific paper. Not because I like the feel of it, although I do, but because it matches the work. So every decision I ever make is about the stories and the subjects and the work. And that's a really, really important thing, I think, to know that, and it's a question I've been asking myself, I asked myself a lot a couple of years ago, which I kind of asked other people now, is I always try and think who I'm making work for. And there's a lot of different answers you can get for that. I guess they're probably all right, on your point of view. And some people, or some of you, maybe think that you made the work for yourself because it's what you want to do. And in some ways, that's kind of right from my point of view. And some people might be thinking that you make work for a client, and that's kind of right as well. But for me, there's only one person that I make the work for. And it's not even for my audience. You know? And they're really, really important. They're more important than me. But the one person that I really make my work for is the people in the work. So the subjects, the people whose stories I'm telling. To me, that's without doubt the most important aspect of any photographic project that I do, is the people behind the stories that I'm telling in that way. And that's why when I can make it work in exactly the way that those stories need to be told, that's why that's really important in that way. So I had this idea, photograph some of the basically abandoned military coastal defences around the coastline of the UK and Northern Europe. I didn't have a huge amount of money. I was still working in bars or restaurants, but I had this big plan of what I was going to do. I wasn't sure how I was going to fund it at the time. But so I thought, well, I have to start somewhere. So I started doing some tests. I used to work with large format cameras. I went out to the coast of Norfolk and I started making some tests there. I didn't know what the images were going to look like until I got the locations. I did a little bit of location research to find 6 or 7 locations in that same area. And then I went there and I photographed them. And the one difference I made on this piece of work compared to all the pieces of work I'd done before, which, when I look back at my scene was pretty unsuccessful, is that I really cared about the photographs. I spent a huge amount of time on the research. I spent a huge amount of time taking each photograph, but I also spent a huge amount of time working out how to make the photograph. And as these were on location, the most important thing was basically 2 elements to it. There was a composition, obviously, what things look like when I got to the location. But more important than that was the lighting. I've always been a real believer in that you don't have to be in a studio to control your lighting. I never make work in studios. All my work is always on location in people's houses if I'm doing portraits of them. And it's all about the lighting that is there and choosing when to take your photographs. So for all these photographs, I took them at very specific times a day, as early as I could. I did that because I didn't want any people in shots. I also did it because I wanted the light to be as soft and flat as possible. I didn't want any kind of contrast or shadows or sunshine because that would add elements to the images and the stories I didn't want to be added. And what I would do was quite simple. I would go to these locations and I'd go there just with my phone and I'd take recce's. I'd go there the day before I was due to make the shoot and I'd just take some compositional recce just with my phone, or could have been a digital camera, the same thing, and see what I wanted to photograph and walk around these spaces. I would never walk up to the space and just take a photograph and leave. It was always walking around and within a space to find out exactly the right composition for the story I was trying to tell. Excuse me. Then go back and stay in a B&B or a hotel and then get up really early the next morning in this soft grey light that I've been promised and go and make my image like this, as you can see. So that element to making the work is really important. And it followed the whole 4 years I made this work. It followed that work through that course. So there's a lot of planning into it. So you have your idea, then you have your research into locations. And then you start working these locations, you think about your compositional elements, you think about how the compositions and the way you're taking photographs, how they're helping you tell the stories that you want to tell in that way. So it involved a lot of traveling. It also involved about 4 years to make this work. And that's kind of what I did for 4 years for that. So the work was made, I haven't got a map here, but the work was made all around the coastline of the UK, and then on the Northern European coastline from Norway down to the French and Spanish border. And I photographed about 100 or so locations altogether. And in the complete work at the end in the book, there's about 80 or so images, 85 images, what edition of the book you're looking at. And there's lots of text as well. So when we came to make the book, we had someone do text or research into every single location on a photograph. So this is like a spread from the book. So you can see on the right-hand side, it's got the location of where this is taken, and then the research that's made into it. And that's really important to me. You may once in a while hear some people saying that photographs don't need words. If a photograph needs words, it's a poor photograph. I know this might sound like a bad thing to say, but they're idiots. They just don't want to take the time to think about photography. Context is everything in an image. If you want to make a really good image, it needs to be about something. Otherwise, it's just a photograph of nothing in particular, and it's very boring. It's important to have that story, that subject matter. And when you're creating works, text can do a huge amount to add to that. And so in all my books, I have lots of text. So I actually talk about people reading my books, even though obviously photo books. I never want to shy away from that. So I always tell people what they're looking at, where they're looking at. And it's really important because it gives you as a viewer, it gives you information about the image you're looking at and the story. But it allows you to add your own history, the things that you may know about those things already, onto that as well. And you can start to picture yourself in this place and imagine yourself in these locations. So that's what I did for those 4 years, was drive around, walk around, and make work. It's obviously not easy to get funding for things like this. So what I did is I used, it was a crowdfunding, which you've all heard of, I assume, like Kickstarter and stuff like that. Has anyone not heard of it? So that's a yes or a no or something, who knows. I'll take that as a yes in that case. So it's a way of basically getting funding to make your work before you make it. And I generally use that for books, which is really important. So it's like pre-sales of books and things like that. But in this instance, since the only time I've done it this way, I use it to actually get money to make the work. So I've done my first few locations based on some money I'd made through kind of print sales and teaching and working bars and stuff like that. And I took that, I made some photographs, and then I showed that. And I ran what I would call a Kickstarter campaign, but I used a platform called Indiegogo, which is what was enabled at the time. And I actually ended up doing 2 for this project, and this one was made about £4,000 or so. Then I did a second one, which made about the same amount again. And that gave me enough money to make the work. So making a project is hugely expensive if you make a long-term piece of work. The following work, which I'll tell you about, with landscape, cost about £35,000 to make the work altogether. And then another £30,000 to make the book. But I'll explain to you how I funded that as well at the same time. The idea is that you get into a role, so you take a bit of money from your last project and you put that into starting the next project. So you can take some photographs, you can then show people. You can do crowdfunding campaigns, or you can find funding in other ways, and then that gives you the money to make the work. And the money you need to make it work is very simple. You know, it's not for buying new cameras and stuff like that. It's for hotels and travel, burgers, baguettes, everything you need to go somewhere and make photographs. You know, in the case of this project, it was film costs as well, and scanning costs, etc., etc. So it depends on how you make your projects. And that was quite a while ago. And then that was the book. And that book's done really well. So we've just sold about 3,800 copies of this book. It's just had its 3rd edition reprint. It's just sold out. And we're just designing at the moment. So that's the designer I was talking to today. We're just designing a new edition at the moment. And it just keeps selling. And to be honest, I'm not sure why. But I'm not questioning it because it's great. And it feeds me and my family. So we just keep doing it that way. And every time you do a new edition, it's like a different design, different materials, etc., etc. And that's what 1,000 books looks like when they get delivered to your house. I didn't have any storage in those days. So because I self-publish, I get all the books myself. But I can talk about that a bit more later on as well. So that work was fairly successful. I made that between 2010 and 2014. Had a number of exhibitions, lots of articles, did various talks, etc., about it. Excuse me. And I thought that would be kind of the end of it, but it just kept on going, and kept on going, and kept on going, which was great. Are there any questions at all so far? I'm going to assume from the silence, probably not. We'll keep going. If you have anything, just ask away, because when I'm gone. And so when I finished that piece of work, it was in about 2014, I started immediately thinking about my next piece of work and what I could do. And I'd always wanted to make a piece of work about Holocaust. It felt like a subject that was important for me to do, something I wanted to speak about, but I wanted to speak about it and try and speak about it in a way that hadn't been spoken about before. Otherwise, it's kind of what's the point in doing it. I wanted to try and give voices to people whose voices maybe hadn't been heard before, specific people, but tell it in a slightly different way and get away from the idea of it being a piece of history which is about numbers. In this case, numbers is anything between 6 million and 10 million people. So the idea was to get away from that and turn it back into individuals, very specific individual people. And it's a piece of work I've been wanting to make maybe for about 10, 15 years. And when I did my MA with you, Mark, the work I did at my MA kind of hinted at it, and it started that process. It wasn't that successful, I don't think. But anyway, it took about 10, 15 years to get to that point where I felt maybe I was good enough as a photographer to do it. And that's, and I'm always happy being honest about myself. I just didn't think I was good enough. to make a piece of work about this particular subject matter. And then when I finished the last end, I felt I was. I felt that I had a visual language that would work, a visual language that was kind of sensitive and soft and subtle enough for that. So I started researching into the work, talking to family, friends, historians, and I went, as I'd done the last band, I went down to a location to do some tests to see what would happen. I went down to a location in the south of France, quite near Marseille. And I had the idea that I was going to go and stand at the top of the hill, if I could find a hill. And I was going to photograph these locations very much as I photographed the last stand. I would stand back, and I'd look at these places and see how they sit in the wide landscape around them, and make my images. And that would be that. It would be quite a simple continuation. I remember that I went down there and I took a whole bunch of cameras up with me. I took a large format camera with me because that's what I had been working with. And I took a medium format camera with me because that's what I kind of wanted to work with. I was working for and a digital camera. And I remember I set my large format camera up, I put a hood over my head, just like that. Felt completely and utterly wrong. And I never took a single picture with my large format camera because I felt that I was gazing at this location. I felt that I was staring at it behind a piece of glass under a hood. And for me, it felt totally and utterly wrong. And that's only for me. For someone else, it may have been the perfect tool to use, but for me, it didn't feel right. And that was quite a strange feeling for me because I spent 4 years working with this type of camera, very happy, expecting to make exactly the same kind of work about a different subject, but it didn't work at all. So I took some photographs with a digital camera I had with me from the same on a tripod, which is always the way that I used to work, still doing sometimes. And then I went back to my B&B and I looked at the photographs, which was of this old internment camp in the middle of the plateau in the south of France. And the pictures left me completely and utterly cold. They were nice photos. The light was good. It was the kind of light that I like. And the pictures were well composed, and you could see this place in the middle of nothing, in the middle of this country. But there seemed to be absolutely no connection between the photograph that I was taking and the history. There seemed to be no connection between the photograph I was going to make and the people and the stories. And I remember feeling a bit lost that night because I'd had this big idea for like 10, 15 years, and I finally felt I was good enough to make it. And I started it, and it was a rush, to be honest. It was a nice photo, but a nice photo isn't enough. It has to be so much more than that. And it just didn't work. And so I was eating my pizza. I remember all the stuff I ate, all the different places. And I wondered what I could do. And the thing is, I knew exactly what I needed to do to make this work. I needed to do basic things I was afraid to do, that I wasn't doing. And that's, I needed to go into these places. I needed to actually engage as a human being with these places physically and see what it felt like to be inside this place. So that's what I did. So the next morning I woke up and I walked to the place, and there was like a big kind of 10-meter earthwork that surrounded it. The whole area was used by the French Secret Service, which I didn't know at the time. I found out a few days after, which explained some of the stuff whilst I was there. I remember climbing over this big 10-meter earthwork, and I just like tore some kind of ligaments in my knee and stuff like that. A few months before that, playing football, last game of football I ever played. So I kind of fell down the other side. And I found myself inside this place, in this old internment camp, looking for a very specific barrack. The barrack is a place where people were kept. It was called Barrack 22, I think. And it was a place where children had been kept, where children were taken from their families. Whole families were taken down to this internment camp. And they were taken there because they were Jewish, or they were taken there because they were communists, or they were intellectuals, or they were Roma, or gypsies. And they were taken there, and all the children were separated and kept in a separate barrack. And the person I started my research with, they told me that inside this barrack where the children were kept, there were these paintings on the wall that the children had made. And a Swiss Red Cross worker had gone there to visit the children to try and make them feel better, and brought paints with them, and had got the children to paint scenes of happiness. So they'd painted trains going through tunnels in the forest, or ships travelling across the ocean, all the kind of normal things that 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids would paint. And I was told that at this particular barrack you could still see those things. So I spent a couple of hours trying to find this place, and I finally found this barrack. I don't actually have a picture of it here, sorry. But I found them. And it was a 3-sided barrack with no roof, because that caved in years ago, and one wall missing. But I remember on the floor, which was covered with the old roof tiles, there was a snaking path that walked through the area. The barrack was a bit like a classroom, that kind of size. And I later found out that the pathway had been made by the French Secret Service because they knew that people went into this place and looked for these things. So I followed my foot for the pathway, and I found these paintings on the wall. And they're incredible. They're these beautiful 75, 80-year-old faded paintings made by children who were pulled away from their parents and their families, and more than likely taken away on trains to be murdered in Poland or Germany, various other countries. And you can see these paintings there, and they're still there today, and they're incredibly powerful and incredibly beautiful. And as you can tell, I was slowly realizing what I needed to do by letting myself go into this very specific location. And then I remember I was walking, and my foot hit one of the tiles that was on the floor, and it made a massive crack, like a cracking sound. It was a bit like being in a whispering gallery somewhere. And because I was in this space where I had this stuff in my head about these children being separated from parents and being taken away and murdered, it immediately sounded like a child's scream. And I remember literally running out of this location, running from it. And I remember as I walked, as I ran out, I passed small little flowers on the ground. And I thought nothing about them at all. And then I'd gone about 10 yards past them. And for whatever reason at that moment, it struck me that these flowers reminded me of those children. So I went back, I remember this story really well. I went back and I photographed one of these little flowers because I thought it was one of these children. That's what it felt like to me. And then I walked away again. And then I was about 10, 15 yards away, and I stopped, and I suddenly realized, and I remember I started crying. I remember saying to myself, how can I do this? How can I only photograph one of these children? How can I leave the rest behind? And so I went back, and I've always photographed stuff on large format cameras, on tripods, really slowly, one photograph a day kind of thing. And I remember really manically photographing every single one of these little flowers, which was just like weeds on the ground, thinking that unless I made this photograph, whether it was used or not, unless I made this photograph, the memory of that individual child would be lost forever. The story would never be told, no one would know that. And so that's what I did. I photographed every single flower. And it was really in that moment that this whole work changed for me. Sorry, I stopped it. That this whole work changed for me, and I realized what I needed to do the work about. The work couldn't just be about a location that was 70, 80 years old in history in the middle of the landscape, but it had to be about people. And that people are everything. And the stories of those people is absolutely everything. So that's what I did. So I spent the next, let's go back to that one a bit. I spent the next 6 years making this work. I spent about 6 months or so photographing a number of locations myself that weren't directly connected to any specific stories. But this was me going to large locations and making the work that I found. And then with that work, I then found fun to make the work. So I had a little box of prints, 7 by 5 inch black box. I filled it with images that I'd made over those first 6 months, and I started showing it to people. And I gave a talk early on about this work, and at the end of this talk, which was on some gave me, I think it was like £5.13, because that's what they had in their pocket. They said they wished they could give me more, but that's what they had. And then someone gave me a check of £500 the next day, because that's what they wanted to give me to make the work. They didn't expect anything from it. There was no strings attached to it. I didn't have to do this, I have to do that. They just wanted me to make the work. And I could really see that because I was now making work about people, about human interest stories, it was really catching people's attention. So over the first couple of years, that's what I did. I basically just got money from people, as in they gave it to me because I told them about the work. So there was, £50 here, £1,000 here, £2,000 here. I got about halfway through the work, but the whole time I knew also that I was going to have to find full funding to make it work. Because I kind of worked out that the whole cost was about £35,000, £40,000 to make it work. So I ended up in a meeting through 9 degrees of separation to get to a meeting with someone, to a funding body that gave money for artists to make work about memory and history. And I gave them a really clear budget, which was something like £18,423. I just thought I should be very specific. It was down to exactly all the locations I travelled to for what each location visit cost me in terms of, was there a flight, how much that cost me, was there a car hire, how much that cost me, how much did I spend on food, how much I spend on accommodation, film costs, all those kind of things. So I gave them this budget and I had about an hour meeting. I could tell there was about 6 of them around that it seemed to be kind of working with some of them and others were a bit less interested, maybe a bit like this room. And then I got a phone call about an hour later as I was walking down Regent Street in London. And the guy Ben, and he was like, Mark, I've got some good news and some bad news to tell you. And so immediately I'm thinking, good news, that's brilliant, they want to give you some money. I can make it work. But at the same time, it's bad news. What does that mean? It's like, well, we can't give you all the money that you need. So I was kind of really upset straight away thinking, how can I finish it? But he then said to me, if you can find the £341 yourself, we will give you a cheque for £18,000. Which I was very happy with, obviously, as you can tell, because that meant I could complete the work. And that's what I did. A week later, there was a cheque through the post, it was postal. And I paid into my bank, and it meant I had all the money I needed to make this work, which meant that over the next 6 years, I could go and photograph all these locations. So I photographed about 150 locations in about 22 different countries. Also. And after those first 6 months, what I realised I needed to do was, as I mentioned, was about telling stories. I didn't want to meet loads of people to start with. I didn't want to meet a specific number of people. I didn't want to meet someone who'd been to a specific death camp, a city, which, places you may have heard of, like Auschwitz and places like that. I didn't want to make those choices. I didn't want to choose, because to me that felt wrong. That felt really arbitrary. It felt like me deciding that one person's story was more important than another person's story. It would have meant me deciding one person's life is more important than another person's life. And of course, I've no control over that kind of thing. So I met with the first person, because that was easy. I had access to that story in most cases. And she told me our family story. And then she introduced me to a friend of hers. And she introduced me to another person and another person. And that way, we ended up with 22 stories. And again, that's kind of a random, arbitrary number that they just. Each one was introduced to me by the one before. 3 of them came from a bus journey in Israel, going from one place to another to follow one of these stories. And she asked me what work I was doing. I told her, she said, would you like to meet some other Holocaust survivors, their families, because I used to work looking after them and stuff like that. So 3 came from there. So it's a big kind of number in that way. I only had 21 stories for about 2 years, and I'd been in a location in Germany near Dachau, which is a death concentration camp in Munich. And I'd come across a cemetery where there was like a big tragedy there, mass murder, thousands of people. And I noticed somebody put a small plaque on one of the cemetery walls, which was homemade and laminated it and screwed it onto the wall, which was about their grandfather. And I got in touch with them, kind of found the name and followed them on Facebook and got in touch with them that way. And I've asked them that, would you like me, would you be happy for me to take photographs and use them and tell your family story if you want in the work that I'm making? And she looked at my works. I had some online already, and I showed her the stuff I've been doing. And she said that it looked wonderful, but she wasn't ready yet because they were still discovering their own family story. And that's it. It went cold, and there was no more communication. And so I had my 21 stories. And then about 2 years later, I got a random Facebook message. This same person saying, Mark, we're ready. Do you still want to share our family? And so I said, yeah, that would be amazing, but I'd run out of money, but it was quite again. And I told her, I said, Daphne, I've got no more money. I'll try and find some money, and I can fly to Holland to meet you, and then we can meet, and you can tell me your story. And she said, okay. About half an hour later, she phoned me up, and she said, Mark, I'm coming to England tomorrow. I'm flying to Bristol. I'll meet you in Bath, and I'll tell you our family story. So that's where the 22nd story came from, which is amazing. And that's kind of one of those things that I've kind of realised by making that particular work, actually, that if you open yourself up to possibilities, really amazing things can happen. There's loads of times when I made that work where I was at a real dead end, and I thought there was no way I'm going to find the location I wanted to find, but something would always happen that would show us where those locations were, which was wonderful. So over those 6 years, photographed, like I said, about 150 or so locations. I would meet with the person, one of the survivors or their family of people who survived or people who survived, and I would sit and I would listen to them. I would talk to them, and I wouldn't ask them any questions. And that was a really important thing for me. And maybe in some ways I did it because I'd never really done this before, and I didn't know what to ask people. But it felt right, and I was very much about doing work that feels right to me. So I would sit and I would listen to them tell me their stories and let them share whatever they wanted to share at that moment and during that day. So I would go there and I would sit and we'd drink coffee and we'd eat cake, because there was always coffee and cake. And we'd sit and they'd often tell me, Mark, I have like half an hour. And then 4 hours later, we'd still be talking. And sometimes they say, well, what do you want me to talk about? And I would just say, well, maybe tell me where you were born. And if I could, that was the only thing that I would say, the only prompt that I would give them, because I wanted them to share what they were comfortable sharing. And then after every conversation, then I'd make the portrait. And I've never really made portraits before, so I was kind of learning on the job as I was doing it. But it felt a really natural thing to do. But it was also really important for me to make the portrait after we'd had our discussions, so that they would feel incredibly comfortable with me as a photographer. But also, more importantly, they would show themselves to me in the way that they wanted to be seen. Even though I'd not taken portraits before, I knew that the last thing I wanted to do was put my kind of photographer's style. I didn't want 22 portraits that would look exactly the same, because those were the choices I had made. They obviously look a little bit the same because I'm one person, but it was always where they were comfortable. So, the seating choice was because that's the seat they like to sit in. More than not, that's where we sat and had our conversations. The lighting is all natural, no artificial lighting. And these people would show themselves to me the way they wanted to be seen. And what was really important is I would always ask them to really engage with the camera. And I wanted them to, and this was quite hard because some of them were quite old and they were quite tired from their meeting with me and they're talking, but I wanted them to work really hard for this portrait. I wanted them to show all of you what they had just shown me over the last 4 hours, in some cases 2 days. And so it's a kind of a way of making a portrait that I enjoy in that one. So here, for instance, is Anna on the left and Arthur, her brother, on the right. Arthur had never spoken about anything that happened during the war for a long period of time. He had just after the war, but not since. And he told me that he wasn't going to tell me anything. But he said he was really happy to meet with me. We had a really fantastic chat, and then I could go and meet his sister. So I went and we met, and it was in Brooklyn in New York. We had a really nice evening. Had dinner together, and he told me everything about his life, but he didn't want to mention what happened to him during the war. He just didn't want to talk about it at all. And then a couple of days later, I flew to San Francisco to meet Anna on the left. She told me everything, absolutely everything. And she was the younger sister during the war. She was 6 or 7 years old when all these events happened. But she's worked as a teacher and a professor, and she's written a book and written her memoirs, etc., etc. So there's these 2 different sides to the same story. And then after I would meet with someone, in this case a brother or sister, and I would sit and they would tell me their stories and I would make their portraits. Then I would go to every location connected with them. Obviously I wouldn't take them, I would go myself and I would photograph all the locations, where they were born, to places where they were taken to ghettos, internment camps, escape routes, death camps in some places. And I would do these all one at a time. So what would often happen is that I would meet someone, I would make this work, and then I would meet someone else. And then they would tell me their story. One of those locations was very close to another location I'd been to before. One of the cases, the same location. And so we just went through being told stories, making photographs. And every single image in this book, so the book is about 750 pages, about 350 images altogether. I won't, but I can tell you the story behind every single image. And every image has a really important story to tell. So with Anna and Arthur, they were born in Krakow in Poland, and they were forced to leave there, and they ended up in Lviv, which is in modern-day Ukraine. And they ended up in the ghetto with their parents. And we went and we visited the ghetto, which was here, this location here. The staircase is a staircase that is inside the old building that's still there, that goes to the room that they all lived in, 3 families in one room. And Anna told all these stories about life in the ghetto. Horror stories of people throwing themselves off the balcony, people being taken away, scrapping to try and find grass, to pick off the street, to put in their soups, to try and eat, to make it taste a bit nicer. And she also told me the story of how they escaped from the ghetto, how one day a German soldier came in, but she was scared because she was 6 at the time, and everyone had told her never to show yourself to a German soldier, and that he had some sacks, like cloth sacks, hanging over his shoulder. And that really strangely, her mum said, "It's okay, he's fine, he's going to help you." And that the German soldier told them to get into the sacks. And so he put Anna inside one of these sacks, and he put Arthur inside one of these sacks, and he carried them out over his shoulders. And he put them in the back of a truck. On the back of this truck was 20 or 30 other cloth sacks, each one filled with a child. And that's how they escaped the ghetto, that he drove them out. I remember when I went to the ghetto in the apartment where they were, and then inside the courtyard, in the corner, there was 2 cloth sacks sitting there. So I photographed them obviously, and they went in the book. And they're just cloth sacks, but we put them together with a story. And then they told me the story of how they had escaped from there on the back of the chart. They may have been hid for about a year and a half with another family. And the family was being paid to look after them. So they basically had to hide in these rooms. And I was making photographs of the building outside, knew where the location was, but we weren't going to get in, obviously. And we were making work of the building outside. And as we were doing that, someone opened the front door and came out. So I was working with a fixer, and we slipped in through the front door. And we started making work in the interior of the building. So it's a big apartment building with 3 floors or so. And I was taking photographs of the front door and taking photographs of the staircase, and then someone came back into the building, a different person. And she stopped and she asked us what we were doing. And she could see that I was speaking English, so she asked me in English, obviously my fixer at the time. So we speak English and Ukrainian. So this is English. And then she said, oh, you know, it's a really intriguing story, tell me more. So I told her more, basically told her the story that I'm telling you now. And she said, which of the floors do they live on? And I said, I lived on the 2nd floor. And she stopped. She said, I live on the 2nd floor. Would you like to come in? So we went in. So we ended up in the apartment, which is here on the right, where Anna and Arthur were hidden for 2 years. And Anna had told me about the room on the right, which is where they'd made their escape from. She told me about the room on the left, which was a table under which they had hidden as the Germans came in, and she could hear their boots walk around on the wooden floor. And now Arthur had always looked after them. And then she also told me about their escape, which was, they knew they had to escape. And Arthur said there was a way we could do it. We can take our mother's silver handled head, which is the only thing they had left of their money, because their parents were still in the ghetto at the time, as far as I knew, and throw it over the balcony. And then tell the woman in the house that you have to run out because you've dropped your mother's silver handled hairbrush and you have to leave. You have to go downstairs and pick it up. And she'll let you. And meanwhile, Arthur escaped down the back stairs, which is behind the door you can see on the right hand side. And Anna came when she stopped in front of the woman shouted at her, but she finally let go of her and she let her go. And Anna ran down the main stairs and she picked up her mother's hairbrush and she ran. And she told me how she thought she had lost Arthur and that she was 7 or 8 and Arthur was a couple years older. And what was she going to do? And then he found her. Then they ran off together and they ended up getting to the train station, crawling on the trains, and ended up escaping through the Straits of Skagerrak between Denmark and Sweden and coming to England, and then ending up in America. But they'd also told me the story of her parents. So they told us the story, she told me the story of how once they had escaped from the ghetto, that her parents had managed to escape from the ghetto also. And their parents were being kept hidden somewhere else in the same city. But they would never tell each other where they were, because if one of them was captured, they could tell where the other person was staying. And Anna heard a particular story, and she told me that when she was writing her memoirs, which she did 2-3 years ago, that her brother Arthur, who I showed you the portrait before, had read her memoirs. And then for the first time, he said something about their experiences during the war. He said, no, that's not quite right, how you remember it. So if we have the joys of sound, you can listen to Anna telling the story. Okay. How can we do the sound? It works.
That's a good question.
Normally it just works.
See if you can. Is it not playing at all?
I'm going to play it on the laptop, but not.
Maybe that's.
You
Tell me if you can hear this. Okay.
A couple of days later, he found a woman who.
Can you hear that? Okay? Yeah. Yeah.
A couple of days later, he found a woman who said that she would hire
Put your
him
microphone near it.
a lot of money. So she hid them. They built a false wall, and they basically hid in that place with a little cutout where they could come in and out in back of a chest of drawers, and that's where she put the food. Yeah. But the woman was an alcoholic, and this is all speculation because all I know is what we were told. So I was told by the lady, by our red lady, that this woman went to a bar and must have said something that made somebody in the bar suspicious. And since the Germans paid bounties. He went to the Gestapo and said, I think this woman is hiding somebody. Gestapo went, and what I was told was that they were all shot. Recently, since Arthur read my memoir, he said, you know, I was told a different story. I was told that they sealed the apartment and that they died in that. That was so nightmarish that I just couldn't deal with it. So I prefer to think, however bad shooting is, you know.
So do you all understand? The voice is quite old. It's quite difficult to understand. So the idea is basically the parents were sealed up behind the wall in this apartment where they were hidden and left to die. So I was in the booth after I'd made the photographs of the apartment that I showed you before. I was out for dinner that night with my fixer, who's called Aaron as well. He's not my wife. And we were walking down the street, we were having dinner, and we came out of the restaurant, and I suddenly realised that I was on the same street where Anna's mother and father had been hidden. And we didn't know which apartment it was. Anna and Arthur never knew exactly where their parents were hidden. But I realised I was on that street, and I realised that somewhere on this street there was a house. And in one of these houses, there was a wall. And behind one of these walls, not necessarily was still Anna and Arthur's parents' bones, but possibly they were. So I remember running back to the apartment to get my camera, and then walking up and down this street. And it's a beautiful street in Lviv. And Lviv is an amazing Europe. Feels like a European city, really beautiful, incredibly cultural. And I ran walking up and down the street, trying to find the house, or trying to find which house it may have been like. Quite desperate to make this photograph. And this is what I found. This is, for whatever reason, this is the house that I felt was the right house. And those were the walls that I felt were the right walls. So maybe it's because there was a light on, maybe because there's a slightly religious painting in the bottom right-hand corner, all these possible things. But to me, that was the right house. I remember making this work, and I remember looking through the lens of my camera, and I was using a small rangefinder at the time for this, really thinking that behind those walls, maybe that's where Anna and Arthur's parents still are. So 6 years to make that work. Every single location full of different horrors. So this location, for instance, was in France, on the border. It was the only actual concentration camp on French soil. And I do quite a lot of research when I go to locations. And I found out a fair amount, but I also like to find things as I discover them as I go to these places. So I was making work here about some other stuff particularly. Then I came across this like terrace garden that you can see, which was outside the camp itself. The camp, you can see the security wire and watchtowers, etc. And then by this thing, there was a small plaque, and it basically explained how this was the garden of the camp guards, and explained how the guards' vegetables that's by the strut fertilized by the ashes of incinerated prisoners. So the guards would murder prisoners, they would burn their bodies, and then they would take the ash from the bodies that they had burned, the people they had murdered, and they would spread them over their vegetables to make their cucumbers grow better, or their tomatoes grow better. So for 6 years, as I went from location to location to location, I would come across things like this. And some of this stuff I knew about. And some of these places, like Auschwitz, for instance, you've hopefully heard of, and heard of some of the things that happened there. But all these other places you won't have heard of. And that's what this book is full of. The book is made up of 22 stories, of 22 hugely unextraordinary people. 22 completely ordinary people. The wonderful people who've gone through incredibly difficult things and come out the other side in lucky cases. But before the war, they were just like you. And some of these people were 1 year old at the time these events took place. Some of them were 7, 8 years old. Some of them were 18, 19 years old. But every single one of these people up there could have been one of you, just for want of a different religious belief, a different political way of thinking, being born in a different age, different sexual persuasion, any of these things. And I would discover these things as I went on and on and on. So here, again, in the same camp, excuse me, dance hall on the right-hand side here. which is opposite the hotel, which is in the far right of the picture. And I would read how the dance theatre was turned into a gas chamber, and how the doctor of this camp made this gas chamber because he wanted to study the effects on the human body of his gas. And so he got a particular set of prisoners from a specific camp, Thessalonica and Jews from Auschwitz, 36 of them, they'd been kept aside at Auschwitz because there was an TB there. So they would be healthy. So he could bring them to this camp. So he could take them into this room whilst people sat across in the hotel, drinking coffee and eating lunch. And there's photographs that show that. And he would gas them in this room. And then he dissected their bodies because he wanted to see the effects on their physical bodies of the gas he was using. And these dissected bodies were taken to the university in Strasbourg. And only about 15 years ago, they discovered in these glass jars in a locked cabinet in a room in the University of Strasbourg. So you get all these connections between places, between Thessalonica in Greece, Auschwitz in Poland, and that's why Stritov in France, etc. One more horrible story, and then I'll move on, I promise. Okay. This is stuff that needs to be told. So this is a Chełmno, which is in Poland, and it was the first death camp. It was a place where they really experimented to see how they could murder people on an industrial scale, create things to murder people. And they spent 2 or 3 years murdering people here, buried them all in the ground in a camp forest, which was about 1.5 kilometers away from the town of Chełmno. And they used vans. They would put people into vans after they'd kept them in the churches overnight. They'd put them into these vans and they'd drive them to the forest camp and they would gas them on the way. And then they would bury their bodies. And then 2 or 3 years later, towards the end of the war, they wanted to basically hide the evidence of what they had done. So they got the prisoners that were working there to exhume the bodies, and that means dig up the bodies of the people they had murdered. They then burnt all these dead bodies. They then created machines to crush the bones and the skeletons of these burnt dead bodies. And they then took all the ashes in the bone fragments and they put them into sacks and they threw them into the local river. I've got a photo for it as well, which is what they did there. But the soil is really sandy in this location. Over time, things seep up out of the soil. Turned into an outdoor museum. They basically created these pits, which is where the original are quite beautiful places. They found that soil, so they covered all these pits with small so that people would see it. And then, as I was walking this location, I was walking on the paths, and the footpaths were white stone as well. I noticed on the side between the paths and these pits were these little white coming out of the soil. First I thought it was just stone chippings from the footpath. When I looked, this was really early on in making the work. This was in December 2016. Okay. I realised, of course, that these aren't stone chippings, but these are bones. I remember really clearly, and I remember I was using Hasselblad at the time, and I was looking, and as you can imagine, I was in tears at what I was looking at. There was no way that I wasn't going to photograph it. I had to photograph it. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to record what I've seen. So, for example, I can show you today. So you can now go away and tell someone else today. So sometimes you come across things which are almost impossible. The last thing you want to do is stand there with a tripod making a photograph. If you take on this role as a photographer, that's what you have to do sometimes. And you do it because you're telling stories. So that's the river where they would take the cloth sacks that were those ashes and bone fragments and throw them into the river. So you can imagine the foul basic bodies of people that were murdered and burnt and crushed, thrown into that. So I'd meet person after person after person, and they would tell me all their stories. As you can probably get hours about each photo, I can talk for days about each, but we obviously don't have all the time today. It sounds weird, but I enjoy sharing this stuff because it's important. You know, I enjoy sharing it because it's people's lives who you wouldn't know about otherwise. It's about people's experience you wouldn't know about. And the really important thing, the point to make again, is that these people are no different to any of you or any of your friends, or your grandparents, or your youngsters, if you have them, at the same age as my 1.5-year-old boy. The only difference is what their beliefs were. You can imagine what that is. So the work was completed, about 4.5 years, 5 years of photography altogether. And I knew that I always wanted to make a book out of the work, because for me a book is like the perfect vehicle. It allows me as a photographer to combine text and historical knowledge with images. But I find that it also allows the viewer to really throw themselves into a piece of work. It's quite hard in an exhibition, I think, because you often see work on a wall and it's quite easy to walk past it, or you're surrounded by other people, so you can't take time to look at it. But in book form, you can pick a book up and you can see everything, and that's why I really like working with books and exhibitions as well. So the book again was crowdfunded, like my previous work, but this was the book itself, through a Kickstarter campaign. I haven't got a book here, but it's like about this thick, a bit like a Bible, I guess. 750 pages, 350 images, and all the story text, because that's what the stories needed. So the book was never pre-designed, it was always totally designed around what these 22 stories needed. And that's why the book is that long, that's why it's that heavy, that's why it has that many photographs. So we did a Kickstarter campaign, and when you do a Kickstarter campaign for the book, it's basically like pre-selling the books. And we raised a quite amazing £34,000 through the Kickstarter campaign. Which meant that we could print as many copies of the book as possible. So we printed 1,500 copies of the book. And that £34,000 is fantastic when you take the fees off, the Kickstarter fees, you take the financial fees off, and then you have the printer's cost, which is £24,000 in that case. You have the designer's cost, which is about £4,000, copy editors, translators, sound recorders, etc., 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 etc. So in the end, that £34,000, it made the Kickstarter was just enough to make those 1,500 copies of the book. But I knew that it was such an expensive book to make that I'd probably never be able to print it again. So that's why I printed as many as we could. And then the work was taken on by some galleries. A side gallery in Newcastle approached me about having an exhibition of the work earlier this year, sorry. And they're basically in control of the exhibition, which is fantastic. So that's all the images you can see they have prepared. There's about 8 or so images in the exhibition now. The exhibition ran for about 3 months. They've now turned it into a touring exhibition, which means that they get other galleries to take the work and then move on to another gallery, another gallery, another gallery. So that's the work, the side gallery. And then, for instance, the opening at Impressions Gallery in Bradford on Saturday, that's the first of the touring exhibitions. So side gallery have all the images framed and they send it all to the next gallery. And so the exhibitions have, we try and make the exhibitions a bit like a book in a way. So there's all the images on the wall, there's lots of text, there's extra captions to read, small booklets to read, but we have sound as well. So when I met with all of the people, the 22 people, I would record our conversations on audio. Not very well, unfortunately. I'm not very good at that. I'm better now. But we have that sound. And they also made kind of incidental location sound recordings at certain random locations where they felt right, whether it was the sound of a train or the sound of a river or the sound of birds appearing above a square in eastern Kharkiv, in eastern Ukraine. I was following another story of these 20,000 people that were marched from this square to a forest about 1.5 kilometres away at the moment. So that's what an exhibition allowed me to do, which is both classrooms can do. But the way I look at it is I don't see one thing as fighting against other than the book is here, an exhibition is here, me giving this talk is another thing. We're also making an online version of the work, a digital version of the work, which is going to be available free to access, which is great. It's going to be through the website, but also through Holocaust Centre North, which is based in Huddersfield, which will contain images and text and sound again. The idea being that we want as many people as possible to see this work. How you all doing? Okay? Yeah, it's not easy stuff, but I don't apologise for it because it's important. Yeah. It is obviously hugely reflective of events that have continued to happen throughout time, and they're happening today and will unfortunately happen tomorrow. How long have I got left on?
An hour?
I'll talk for a little bit more, and then you guys need to start asking questions. Otherwise, my voice disappears. Have you got any ideas of things you'd like to ask? Are you willing to stay at shock?
Can you tell us about your new project?
Yeah, because I was going to tell you about this one, but I won't. I'll just go through that. But that was a nice project to make. But yeah, my new book. So that's this one here. So as I mentioned before, I've always done work which is about the past. It's always work about history and memory and landscape and that way. But then things have changed. So my wife is Ukrainian. She lives here in England with me. She's in where are we? Manchester. Here in Manchester, with a little baby boy, and mother-in-law as well. So her mother-in-law is over here as a refugee. Her sister as well. Her father's coming over in about a month or so. He's finally able to come over. And Anna lived here before the war, obviously, and our baby was born before the main Russian invasion. So when I met Anna, I spent like a huge amount of time in Ukraine. So we met working together. She was my fixer. And I then spent a huge amount of time in Ukraine, traveling all over the country and making work. And she told me in the first few months we met about this amazing magical village called Balaklia. It's very nice to talk about something beautiful after all that stuff I just which was this village where her grandmother lived. Her grandmother was born, and her mother lived. Where Anna used to go as a young girl, and she would learn to swim in the river, and her sister went and learned to swim in the river. And they made lifelong friends. And it's a tiny village, there's 300, 350 people that live there. And I've been there as well. And I remember that when I went there, there's something incredibly amazing about this place. And I've always lived in cities, so I've never lived in a village, so I had no concept of what it was like to live in a place like this. But it was beautiful, it was quiet, it was incredibly hard work, it was an agricultural working village. But people did learn to swim in the river. And we got water out of the well every morning, and then we fill up the summer shower, which is basically like a wooden shack and garden with a metal pot on top. And you fill it up with water. Then after you cut the house when the water's warm, you move a little metal switch with some holes in it, and you have a shower. And it was a really amazing place. And I remember that all the 2 summers I spent there, I felt really compelled to take photographs of this location. And I didn't know what I was taking the photographs for, but I knew it was something important. When I would meet people, I wanted to take portraits of them. When I would see locations, I wanted to take photographs of those spaces. When I would see children running around in fields or outside houses, or they'd be sat in our garden and be eating melons together, I felt I needed to make this work. I didn't have a particular project in mind. But I wasn't taking these photographs casually either. I knew I was taking them for just a purpose. I didn't know what it was. Then obviously, early February last year, full-scale Russian invasion, everything changes. Me and Anna had been already working on the project about Ukraine, telling stories of people throughout the country, which we had to put on hold because we have a young baby, so we haven't travelled back there for 2 years. And I've done lots of stuff in the country. We've done print sales of images I've taken them. We've raised lots of money, which we've sent to various places there. But then we wanted to do more. And we decided that we wanted to make a book. And that's what this book is. And the book is called The Land is Yellow, the Sky is Blue. And if you know the Ukrainian flag is yellow and blue because that's where those colours come from. They come from the yellow of the land and the blue of the sky. And we just gave a talk about this. We had our first exhibition in the My Festival in Colwyn, and we just gave a talk about it together on Tuesday. And it's really nice to be talking with someone. Excellent. And I got all the applause at the end. I got none, obviously. That's right. But we wanted to make a piece of work that would show the beauty of the country. Now, there's enough photojournalists over there taking more photographs. What we wanted to show the beauty of the country. We wanted to show why people are fighting for it, why people are dying for it, why people are defending from it, the things that people have had to leave, had to flee from, what they want to go back to. We wanted to show that side of the country. But we also wanted to show that in the time of war as well, because that's what they are, they're at war. So we came up with this idea of using these images that I've made over those 2 summers in this place, but combining it with text that's written now. Someone else's word, text under the shadow of war. So that's what we've done. We've created this book and this exhibition that shows that. So we've made a series of photographs that are very beautiful, much more beautiful in a way than any photographs I've ever taken. Some of them even have blue skies and sunshine. And I enjoy taking them, which is really lovely. But then there's text with it as well, and portraits. So this, for instance, is Rina, and she's the daughter of a good friend of ours called Larissa. And Larissa's brother is called Yannick. And Yannick was basically moved to the front very early on during the war. He suffered very bad concussion, he's in hospital at the moment. But the first thing he said when he came back, and the first thing he said when he came round is, I want to go back to the front. I want to fight again. But whilst he's out the front, his daughter Rima, his wife, and their other 2 kids are left in the village. And his sister Larissa, with her mother and her daughter, are left in the village. It's a very small village. There's 350 people. If you imagine a village of 350 people, you can kind of imagine this room actually. You know, it's kind of, there's kids, but then there's half women, half men. And what happens when all the men in the village have to leave? Who drives the tractors, but still looks after the children? Who digs up the soil, but still looks after the children? Who plants the seeds, but still does the cooking? So all of a sudden, every woman in this village, so the village suffers hugely because of that. Also what happens is you have, there's no father figure, there's no older brothers. So all these kids, Anna and her sister and her friends, when they used to go there in summer as children themselves, all these kids that they used to like ride around on motorbikes with, eat pot noodles, drink their first beer with, fall in love with it the first time. And these young boys used to play guitar, you know, worse, they're now fighting at the front. So we have huge amounts of friends who are students like themselves, or they're photographers, work photographers, or they're artists, or they're computer programmers, or they're writers. And they've had to put down their pens, and they've had to put down their cameras, and they now have guns in their hands. And they're now fighting, and they're now dying at the front. But they have to, because they have no option. And so that's what we wanted to do this work. We wanted to show why these things are happening. We wanted to show why husbands and wives, boyfriends and girlfriends have to go to the borders with Poland and Hungary and Romania. And why the boyfriends and husbands have to push their wives and girlfriends over the border because they don't want to leave. And obviously they don't want them to leave. It's the last thing they want to do is be separated from them, but they have to because they can't stay and fight. And they want them to survive. They want their young children to survive. All these things are important. So there's all these things in this book. And also in the book, there's all these underlying layers of guilt that you have. So every Ukrainian, and it's the same with everyone in a similar situation, in whatever country they're living in, it's a war, they have these different layers of guilt. So the people that have managed to escape from this war zone, they're guilty because they've escaped, because they're alive. Some men have left as well, because if you have more than 3 children, you can leave also, because the Ukrainian government didn't want families with 3 children to have no dad, so they've been able to leave as well, which is fantastic for their children. But they feel guilt because their friends are there fighting and dying. The people that are over here feel guilty because they're not doing enough. The people that were here before the war feel guilty because they weren't there at the time. The people that were out of the country when the war began and now living here, for instance, feel guilty because they haven't been able to go back to their country. The people that are here but haven't gone back feel guilt because some people are going back. And they're okay, they're alive, until they're not, until they're dead. So Larissa in the village, she tells a story of how at night they hear missiles fly over their head. They hear the Shahid, if that's the right name, the Shahid drones, the noise of those flying over their head. And then they hear the sound of their anti-missile defense, Ukraine stuff. And they feel so happy when nothing lands on their village. But she also, in the same breath, says how unhappy she is because if it's not landing in their garden, and it's not landing on their house, it means it's landing on someone else's house. Someone else's house is exploding. Someone else's child is dying. My wife's father, he was in a small village in central UK, and for the first 3 or 4 weeks of the war, his village was occupied. So for 3 or 4 weeks, the 2 shops in the village were destroyed. They had no supplies, no medicine, no food. They lived off the land, sharing with each other. He has a 96-year-old mother who passed away a few months ago, but he was looking after her at the time. And then people were trying to escape in the village, and they were shot, women and children, shot on the side of the road by the Russians, trying to escape. And when the Russians finally left 3 or 4 weeks later, the whole village was covered in landmines. And so this was just before spring. So they had to desperately try and clear all the landmines before everything became overgrown. So those are the reasons why we made this work. Nana tells the story much better than me, because I have it all in a way through second-hand experience. But we made work about this place. So this is Anna's grandmother's house. where her grandmother used to live, and when Anna was a young child, where she would go and play. And that's Anna's mother on the right, her grandmother's husband on the table, and then brother. And then there's this girl called Masha who swims in the river. And then we have 3 children who are the children of my sister-in-law, and we asked them to do illustrations for the book. We asked them quite simply, and they're over here now, we asked them quite simply to draw what we think about the village. And this was the first drawing that we got, which was from Masha. And I don't know if you're the same, but I know Mark is from the look on his face there. But the first thing I see when I see the picture is blood. I see rivers of blood on the street. But that's not why she drew this. We asked her, why did you draw red? And she said, I like red. Simple as that. And there is that amazing childhood innocence, but at the same time, you know, I've seen these children's faces. I was flying out to the border trying to help them escape, and they escaped, and they'd already made it to France by that time. And they'd been in their basement for 3 nights with tanks moving around the house, because they lived just outside here. And at one point it was quiet, and the mother said, children, went upstairs and packed rucksacks. So you have 1 rucksack each. What would you put inside it? And that's what they had to choose. And they chucked it all in the car, and they drove to the border, and Max wasn't with them. And then he joined them. And then they made it across the border into Hungary, and they stayed 1 night in Hungary. But they couldn't stop, even though they were safe, because they didn't feel safe. They went to Germany, and they stayed with another set of friends, but they couldn't stop because they didn't feel safe. They made it to Geneva in Switzerland, they stayed with my cousin, but they couldn't stop because they didn't feel safe. 1 night in each of these places. And then they made it to France. And we had a friend whose basically village offered themselves up to this family, and they moved out of their house so that they could live in their house. And they stayed there for a couple of weeks, and I went over there to help them, and then we arranged visas, which was a whole other thing itself. And then they came over here to the UK, which is where they are now. But the weird thing is that all they want to do is go back home. This is the last place they want to be. They love it here. I know those 2 things don't make sense, but they do. The kids really enjoy their schools. They love England and everything that England's given to them. They're trying to make their business here. They're trying to make their lives here, but the last thing they want to do is make their lives here. Imagine you're planning to go to the shops later on. You plan, and you go to the shops later on. Imagine you're going on holiday next week. You pack a bag, you plan it, you go on holiday. Imagine you decide to emigrate. You think, what do we need to do to emigrate? And you make decisions, you make plans, you maybe find a house, you maybe find a job, and you choose to do this, and you go abroad, and you make your new life. But all these people, they've been forced into these decisions. So they're here, or Holland, or Spain, or America, or Canada, or Portugal, or wherever, spread around the world. And they've been forced to make new lives themselves because they have to, because unless they make this new life themselves, their children won't eat. The last thing they want to do is make this new life themselves. So the moment they're happy, they feel guilty. I remember my sister-in-law breaking down in Lidl in the car park because she was enjoying herself. She had done a big family shop, and she was like, that was great. And then she broke down in tears because she was so sad because she was happy. So those are all the kind of things that we're trying to get across in this book. That way. So it's a series of portraits, landscapes, there's text in the book, stories. So all the text in the book comes from people that are either living in the village now, or have been in the village, or have that direct, close connection with it. So the images were taken before the war, and all the text is since the war. And so that's what this is. So this book was made about 3 weeks ago. As I kind of mentioned before, I self-published my work now. I did work with a publisher to start with. So the first few editions of my first book. And then that relationship went a little bit sour because he was mad, basically. And then luckily he went out of business, and I bought the last 200 copies of the second edition from him, very begrudgingly from him. I sold those pretty quickly, and then I started this whole self-publishing thing, which I'm happy to talk about if it's of any interest to you. But what it does, it allows us to make a book in exactly the way we want it. So the choice of paper is because this is the paper that we want to choose, because it's exactly the right paper for the images in this book. It may be totally the wrong paper for anything else, but for these images, in this story, in this book, it's perfect.
Can I ask you a question? Sorry, I've been holding this. I've been letting you talk because everybody wants to listen to what you've got to say. There was, it seems to me that there's a lot of the early work that you did. There's a certain kind of stillness to your aesthetic, and even this this latest work. There's real kind of, again, a kind of stillness to it. Was that? Do you think that's a conscious decision? Because the obviously the Ukrainian position is moving, but your take on it is very similar to the previous ones. It's almost like you're kind of there now earlier than you would be where you'd go later on to see the same things. You know what I mean? So, and I like that. For me, I kind of like that continuity. That there is a certain stillness, and I'm saying stillness, but timelessness, I think, is probably what I mean there. Is that even though these things, these marks, you know, of the landscape all the way from the earth of the concrete, the bunkers and everything, there's a certain kind of timelessness where time kind of just continues, and these they've scarred the landscape, they've affected people, whereas time carries on, and that seemed to be some of the kind of themes in that, especially things like, you know, the girls' hood in the water could have been taken, you know, in the latter part of the 19th century just as easily. It could have been taken 20, 30, 40 years ago or yesterday. So there's a certain kind of timelessness in your aesthetic. I mean, can you say something about that?
Yeah, of course. I think when I make photographs, every photograph I ever make is the most important photograph I will ever take. I know it's not. Hopefully one of them is important. But it's the way I like to work, because I'm incredibly considered when I make my work. So whether I'm working with a large format camera, a tripod, or I've got a small rangefinder or a digital camera, whatever, I take as, you may not like me saying this, but I take as few photographs as possible. I'd rather spend.
Yeah, don't tell them that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'd rather spend 30 minutes taking one photograph than take 10 in 30 minutes, because I know that one in 30 minutes is going to be better than any of the 10 I take, because I've got 30 minutes over it instead of 3 minutes. I won't be rushed. No, with a large format camera. Yeah. If I'm working with like handheld camera, like the Ukraine work, I still am really considered. You know, it kind of sounds weird, but I take a photograph before I pick up my camera. You know, I look at a scene unfolding in front of me. I know exactly what I want.
So the process itself is actually embedded in the aesthetic.
Yeah, the process is buried in here.
Yeah.
You know, whatever camera I'm using just affects the way I make that photograph. But you know, like I see something unfolding in front of me, and I will think, you know, that's the right moment? That's the photograph I want to make. And then, if I'm shooting handheld, when I pick my camera up, you know, I know where I want to be pointing, and then it's simply a case of at what moment do I press that shutter. So sometimes I'll hold the camera to my eye for a minute, just, you know, waiting for that perfect moment, that perfect bit of movement in that way. So I think it's that consideration I take in each picture. So, you know, whether it's like with the hood over my head on a tripod or a handhold with a rangefinder, it's I care passionately about every single time I press the button. And so I think that's why that kind of stillness comes across.
Yeah, it's like Walter Benjamin says about the moment developing into the picture, that it just seeps into it. It just becomes that kind of timeless moment. I mean, even the portraits, the kind of central, the central composition is very static, and not the sense of dynamism, that one in particular. You know, there's a sense of kind of, you know, it's very painterly, I guess you could call it, but there's a certain stillness to that because of the composition, because of, even though it's quite linear in a way, but there still is a sense of stillness in the gaze, in the choice of light as well. I think is particularly. I'm going to say nostalgic, but I don't think it is. I think there's a certain end of the afternoon feel to it, where time slows down and minutes stretch out.
It's exactly what it was. That's why we were having coffee, you can see cooking, man.
Yeah.
with this image, for instance, I saw the space first.
Yeah,
And so as I walked into Alan's house, I saw this space.
yeah,
And I knew immediately I knew we were going to talk about the important, but I then knew that's almost, some photos not nice of some people inside a house.
yeah,
And in a way, they're cooler photos. There's some great props. And the light is really, really beautiful. But this is one that I used right for her. So I knew that was a space. So after we sat and had coffee, and then I said, can we do the portrait of you now? She said, yes, of course. And she said, where would you like to do it? And I said, well, can we go back to your front door and do it there?
yeah.
So, I got her and she stood there, and she moved and she moved until she was in exactly the right position.
Yeah.
So the work I do, even the one of the girl in the river, I didn't get her to move it where she was just there.
Yeah.
So that's a quicker process, but the thought processes behind making the work in the river photograph are exactly the same.
Yeah,
This one-
it's that
this one
unity,
allows
isn't
for more
it?
simple.
Yeah.
This allows for more control, but
Yeah.
even in a really small time scale, you can still create that control basically by pre-considering what you're doing and
Yeah.
thinking what you want to achieve and composing that image without the camera to your face.
Yeah.
So then the actual taking the photograph is the smallest bit.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you for that. As I say, I mean, in a place like that, and the locations that you found, that you can see from the location themselves that there's 100 different versions of the same picture.
Yeah.
But it's the one that you've taken actually, and the way it links to all of the others, you can see that kind of that thought process all the way throughout. So there's an aesthetic which is part of the process, which is then, brings that unity to the project.
Yes, there's some locations that miss the differences, which I would, we walk through it, and there's I don't have a photo here, but of a playing field with a goalpost and a church.
Yeah.
And the first time I saw it, there was like all the kids in the village were there playing basketball. And there was something really amazing about that, but I realised I didn't want to photograph it, I just wanted to experience that moment. So I then went back there later on in the day when they'd all gone home for their dinner, and then I made the photograph in the empty space because, I often feel that you can take a photograph in an empty space and, we can populate it with our minds, our imagination, especially
So
when doing it in
you
conjunction with other portraits.
You mentioned about storytelling, about how the process that you follow is part of that story, and I think that's quite clear in the different projects that you've taken, that there is that narrative structure throughout, and you very much and your thinking and your process is very much central to this work.
Yeah, it's everything.
Yeah.
It kind of feels weird. I will say this every time I say it, it feels weird saying it, but it's almost like photographs are incidental. It's a really strange thing for a photographer to say, obviously. But what I mean is that the story isn't everything. The story is paramount and utmost, and the job of photographs is to tell that story. So they're not incidental because they're hugely important, but the photographs are created, all these scenes are photographed at that specific moment, because they help convey and tell this story.
But I think it's worth kind of going back over the point you made right at the beginning, which was when we were talking about you'd started a number of different approaches to things, and then had the courage, really, and it is a courage to kind of stop it and go, this isn't working, to realise that this isn't working, even though I can a number of photographs and successful photographs for something else, but that self-reflective practice is really part of that development, where you can stop and go, this isn't the story. I've started this journey, it's heading in the wrong direction. I need to stop, rethink, and then go off in the right direction. And that's quite a bold and brave move to make, because you've started a process, you've got people involved even. And that's another thing I wanted to pick up on. You mentioned a word which I know what it means, but if you could just explain what a fixer is.
Yeah. Do you want to answer first off the question?
Well, either.
Yeah. So a fixer is basically someone who. So if you go abroad, and I've only used fixer in 2 countries. So most of my work about the Holocaust, for instance, was in Western Europe, but mostly Eastern Europe and Ukraine and stuff like that. And most of these countries I would just go by myself. And I don't speak Polish or Romanian or Hungarian or Austrian, but I just got along somehow. But in some countries, in Romania and then more in Ukraine, I needed help basically because I had no idea about the language. And a fixer is someone who is like a producer on the ground for you. So they will, their role can be massive or it can be very small. In my case, it was quite small. But a fixer's role is to set things up for you, to arrange things for you, to, if need be, help you with something as simple as transport and getting a hotel, but also to help with translation. Fixers can also do huge amounts of research for you. They can set up meetings with people who you don't know you need to meet yet, but they think you should meet them. So you end up meeting them. They can arrange for photo shoots. They can arrange all those kind of things. Really important, they can keep you safe. Actually, I've got a good story about that. But in my case in Ukraine, I just needed someone to help me kind of with language skills. I knew where I wanted to photograph. I love letting things happen as I go along. But we had a plan. And then without having my fixer there, I wouldn't have been able to make some of the photographs. So for instance, without Anna being there in the bit, we never would have got inside that building, spoken to the girl Anna that came back in, and then got to the apartment where Anna as well.
It's worth mentioning as well that if you're working with different groups of people, there are certain groups of people who are very guarded and who will not allow access unless you know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody.
Yeah.
So that, the Roma community is one of those, and there are a number of different, ethnic or religious groups that are very, very guarded, quite rightly so, because of the publicity that they've had. So if you want to kind of, to work with those groups, you need to work with somebody who already has built that trust, because the trust that you need in order to make the work has to come from, if it can't come from you, and sometimes it can't because of your language barriers or some kind of, other barriers that you might not foresee, then that can come from someone else.
Yeah, so for instance, when I was doing work about Holocaust, obviously there's a huge amount about that specific. There's a lot of locations and lots of texts that are about the Roma community.
Yeah.
So I felt really important to include it in the stories. I was never trying to choose things, but there's some things that you want to make sure include. So, but it never happened. I had someone that that I worked with, and they put me in touch with someone from the Roma community in Poland. And we met, and it was a really good meeting, and he really liked my work. He was quite big in the community.
Yeah.
And he really liked the work I was doing. And he said, it's because I can show him the photographs. So it's subtle, it's sensitive, it's not, you're not like a photojournalist, I really like it.
Yeah.
But it never went anywhere. Because, he tried and spoke to a few people, and for whatever reason, at that time, they didn't want to share their stories, they didn't want to do stuff, because they'd had trouble over the last few months or something like that.
Yeah.
So they were afraid to kind of come out to the public. And it's not, I didn't want to keep pushing it, obviously.
You can never really tell what's in the background of people's minds, and you as well-meaning as you undoubtedly are, you go in, but you represent the outside or the other people.
Yeah, totally. So all the people that would meet during the Holocaust were their immediate assumption is I was a photojournalist. So the very first thing I would say to them is that I don't work for a newspaper. I'm not a photojournalist, and I had that box of prints, and there was a box of prints that really did it. There was never like a cold meeting; they always knew I was coming along, and they knew my background because I'd been introduced to it in some way. But that box of prints, by showing them the kind of work I was making, is what really put them at ease. It also got me out.
Really?
I was in kind of almost because I was in Transnistria, which is a country that doesn't exist. It's in between Moldova and Ukraine.
Yeah.
So you won't see it on most maps unless you're looking from a Russian map. And when I was taking photographs for the Holocaust project on the coastline, the border between Moldova and Russia, which is a river, about events that had happened there from that region and transported across the river and kind of murdered on the river and then murdered in Transnistria. Time is a definitely a killing region. Before the war of there was basically a small strip of land called Transnistria that's only about as wide that wanted to be independent from Moldova. And they were going to start fighting each other, and then the Russians decided to point their missiles at Moldova and say, we back Transnistria.
Yeah.
So it's still there, but it doesn't exist. The only country in the world that recognises it is Russia, and they only kind of recognise it. But it's a bit of a proxy state to control the industry, and it has its own border crossings, it has its own passports, its own currency, its own everything. And I was trying to get across there in late 2015 to work on the river in Moldova. from Hasselblad on a tripod,
Yeah.
looking across the river, and then I was going to drive up over the bridge and cross the border by myself. I didn't know about things at that point. I thought it will be fine. And I remember that I was driving on the road in this dark car, drove up behind me, like long, stretched black car with blacked out windows. And basically followed me slowly for about 2 or 3 kilometers, and every time I slowed down, it would slow down. And every time I went a bit quicker, it would come a bit quicker. Until I got to the point of the crossing where I needed to turn right to go up and over the bridge into Transnistria. And it pulled along beside me and just stopped. And I was in my little kind of like Nissan car, looking across like that. And I assumed they were looking across at me, but I couldn't see them through the windows. And we sat like that for about a minute or 2 minutes. And then it pulled out in front of me and stopped in front of me and then stayed there for about a minute or so. I was shit scared.
Yeah.
Moldova's a scary place in some ways, especially where that area where I was. And then in the end, they drove off and they went up around, and I could see them going up over the bridge. So I didn't go in Transnistria, which was a good thing that day. Then 3 years later, I did. But I couldn't find a fixer there, but I could find a tour guide who was going to work as my fixer. So there was a specific location I was trying to go to. So he met me on the Moldovan side, and we went across on the bridge. And at the bridge, they kind of looked at my camera, and it was Hasselblad, so okay, I don't know what it is, it must be right. And they basically told us what we couldn't do. They said, you can't photograph this, you can't go there, you can't do this, you can't do that. And you have to come back tomorrow, you can't stay overnight. You need a special permit to do that. So we, on our way to this location, and we stopped at this village in directions of where this basically place where some people were murdered by the river was. And he told us that he knows exactly where it was because his grandfather was one of the people who was murdered for being a communist.
Yeah.
And his name was on there. So we went down to the location. We made the photographs and then we went back to the village and we met with him and he said, come and have some lunch. He was an ex-policeman that now made homebrew wine. Yeah, so you can guess the next 2 hours is basically us spent in his small kitchen shack, plying me with like first white, then red, then a mix of the two. And the more he drank, the more I had to drink. But my fixer wasn't drinking, too. But the more he drank, the more he'd tell us.
Yeah.
So we kind of kept it going, and then we ended up at the next location. I was making some photographs of the cemetery, handheld this time. And at one point, this woman in like a red velour tracksuit, pink fluffy slippers, kind of walked past me. And kind of looked at me like that. When she did, I sort of dropped the camera down to my shoulder, onto my waist, sorry. And then she walked away and I carried on taking pictures. And I walked back around the corner to where my tour guide fixer was. And there was some policemen next to him. And when I left Moldova with the guy in the American embassy, I knew out there, he said, Mark, whatever you do, don't get in trouble. Because if you do, no one can help you. It doesn't exist. There's no one else. No, you can't get out once you're in, unless they want you to go out. So we ended up going to the police station. I walked in to the police, it's kind of like 1970s Soviet Union. And I walked in through the main door of the police station. There was a stone corridor on the left, was a metal or iron cell door that was open, or both. And then I went in and I sat in the sergeant's office for about an hour with him talking to me in Russian, me not understanding, my tour guide fixer behind me. And every once in a while, when the guy would take a phone call, I'd look back and try and get a sense of everything. Was this going okay? And he was showing me nothing at all. I ended up showing him this little box of prints to explain what I was doing. And in the end, he said that someone had made a complaint about you, that they thought you were taking photographs of their house. You know, we can see that you probably weren't. But what we have to recommend, for as fast as you can within the speed limit, you go back over the border and so thank God I had my fixer then. Yeah. Otherwise, probably still be in that jail. So, you know, as well. So fixers are brilliant. So if you're ever going somewhere where that was a long story, sorry. If you're ever going somewhere where you're worried about it, that's what a fixer.
Right. So have we got any more questions?
Work or making work or books or?
You said obviously you're not a photojournalist, that isn't what you do, but there is that sense of like documentary photography within your work. How do you feel about that sense of photojournalism where you can't be involved because you are involved in a way as a documentary photographer?
Yeah, the different, when I said a photojournalist, what I kind of meant more was like a paid photojournalist, someone that's been commissioned by a magazine or a newspaper, and they get sent somewhere for like 2 or 3 days. No, it's not the photographer's fault. It's the time they're given. And they said, go here for 2 days, find a story, and then come back again. Whereas, but if you go to that, sometimes people are very reticent to do that because they think, well, you're just using my story for your newspaper or for your magazine. So it's almost like I had to say I wasn't a photojournalist, not because a photojournalist is bad, because some of my best friends are photojournalists. But it was a way to explain, because they understood what a photojournalist was, but they didn't understand what a photographer was. He was just making his own projects. So it was my way of explaining what I wasn't, so they understand what I was. Yeah. Like for instance, the fixer I know yesterday, they were asked by someone, "Can you find the dark side of the blah 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 story?" And to me, that's what photojournalists are forced to do. Sometimes they have to go somewhere and photograph the dark side because that's what will look good in press or Wired or magazines and stuff like that. So it was kind of my way of distancing myself from that, simply so that the people I was talking to would feel comfortable. So it's not putting down photojournalists in any way at all. It was just using them to look good. Thank you.
So we've got any more questions?
Are you going to go back to Ukraine?
Yeah, got you. Yeah, so like, one I need to go back, to see my friends, family, and stuff like that. And we went on a voyage around to swim in the river. He's from the sea, really, but we wanted to swim in that river. So if we didn't have a little kid, we'd have gone back already. Not to live, but we'd gone back to help and to see friends and stuff like that. But it's just a risk that we've chosen not to take. So, for instance, we've got 2 or 3 different projects that we're making there, and from a photographic point of view, it would be, I use this word badly, it would be incredible to go there, because I can photograph places that I've photographed already. I can find all these stories that weren't there before. There's 2 reasons I don't want to do that. 1, because I can't take that risk for myself, because of my family. And 2, I don't want to sensationalize things. There's plenty of people that are doing that already. So, when we can go back, when it's safe for us to take our all the way back, then we'll do that, and then we'll carry on making the work that we were making before. But it will obviously be slightly different. So yeah, I'd go back tomorrow if I could. But it's just too dangerous. We know enough people that aren't around anymore, stuff like that. So for me to go back, just
Any more questions?
In terms of you've done work from the first people that you showed us with the military structures, and it seemed quite isolated and not really signs of human life. And then the work includes a lot of people. Do you find that working with these people or photographing people in these things is a motivator for you to continue with this work?
Motivator for me, do you know?
Yeah.
I really enjoy it. So I didn't photograph people before for a few reasons. 1, because I felt that if I had a photograph of a person, the photograph would be about them. So if, for instance, there being a person in some of those photographs in the military bunkers, the photograph would be less about the location and less about the history, and less about everyone and more about that one person specifically. So in a way, that's why I didn't do it. I was also probably a bit afraid of working with people as well, just not confident enough. But now it's like, as I've gone on, as I want my work to be more and more about people. My work has to have people in it, but it's always that combination. So the Holocaust project, for instance, there's 350 images. There's only 22 people in the work. There's 22 portraits. That's it. But every single one of those 350 photographs is about those 22 people. It's not just those 22 people. It's about the hundreds and thousands of people that each one of those individuals represent, or their families represent. So it's about 10 million people in that way. So it's more and more important for me to have people in my photographs, but not in every single photograph. But it's also because more and more I want to, my work's become much more story-based. So it's about history and memory and landscape, but it's more about specific stories within that. But each story is like a reflection of other stories. But I really enjoy it. So when I was making that work and I was making portraits for the first time ever, I was really scared. I think it. But in some ways it was quite easy because I sat there with this person for 4 hours. And by that point, they were really tired, but they really, really wanted me to make their portrait. Because they had offered up their lives, they had offered up their stories to me to share. And they knew that an extension of that would be to sit for me and allow me to take a portrait. And everything, all the portraits were done on a tripod, like so, we knew that we both had to work really hard for it. And the whole time I was making each of those portraits, especially the first ones, I was shitting myself, to be honest. Mainly because I was, what if I mess it up? What if I get it wrong? It's not going to be that easy to come back. But because I was doing it in such a slow, careful, considered way, it's something quite easy, if that makes sense. But I loved it as well. I enjoy it. I still really enjoy doing portraits because I still find it a real challenge. You know, all the other photographs are cared and considered, but it feels quite natural to me. Whereas doing portraits, I still feel like I'm having to fight against myself a little bit, but I quite enjoy that because it makes me work that extra bit harder.
Do you feel like, do you use, would you say for these certain portraits, do you use a film camera or a digital camera?
It's a mixture. So the Holocaust project, I used a mixture of film and digital, but that was mostly for production reasons. So, you know, the first kind of 3 years was all shot in film, and then I'd come back and I kind of, even though I was living in Bath at the time, I'd fly into London so I could take my film to the and then sit there for 3 hours whilst it got processed to then take it home. So I didn't want to stick it in the post, you know, after my 2-3 weeks shooting. But then also production, I'd get it home and then I'd have to get the the next sheet and put it on my flatbed scanner and then I shoot. And then I'd have to do some rough scans of each of the individual images. And then I came to I then had to get drum scans done on each one. It was such a massive piece of work that from production I started shooting digitally about halfway through. So that project was a mixture of film and digital formats because of that as well. So most of the work was done in region format. I did run a little 35mm rangefinder as well, because in certain locations that just felt more more raw using that. It's almost getting back to that of the Hasselblad, looking down, that staring too much. It felt offensive. And no one else probably would have thought that way. And it's really important for me that I feel like I'm treating not just people, but the locations. I know this sounds weird, but I want to treat the locations I'm photographing at with respect as well, because then I think I'm making the right work in it. So I always choose the camera depending on the project I'm making. It's never the other way around. So I'm not, whether I shoot large format or 35mm or I shoot film or digital, it's always because of the project. That said, I don't shoot film anymore because it's just too expensive. Sorry, if you're trying to get to shoot film.
Oh, no,
yeah,
no,
but for me, I shoot digitally because it's less expensive, but it's also from a production point of view, I can spend more time doing other things, which is good. I don't have to go to London each time to get more processed. Excellent.
Have we got any more questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. Right, thanks a lot, Mark. Cheers.
If any of you are in Bradford at the weekend, I don't know how far Bradford is from here.